Okay, it seems obvious, but the answer can vary depending on how you see this question. Most likely, you're thinking of the first game in the franchise. Or you can also read it as the first game you've played in the franchise. But what I'm trying to figure out is, what is the first execution of the Smash Bros. Concept? Okay, on a surface level, sure, but if the success of the platform fighter subgenre defined in Smash influenced the creation of these games, then what was the game that influenced the creation of Smash? Or rather, demo. This is also known as Dragon King the Fighting Game, the prototype for what would become the Smash we know today. Developed in 1996 by Masahiro Sakurai and Satoru Iwata, Dragon King was planned as a new franchise for the release of the Nintendo 64, hoping to expand onto an entire series. But more importantly, this prototype became the first tangible draft for Sakurai to experiment something new in the fighting game genre. What if instead of depleting your opponent's health, you get them off the screen to win? Not a 1v1, but a 4-player battle royale. A fighting game with no health bars and a less linear stage. Sakurai's idea, while outlandish at the time, is what would be conceptualized into this prototype. Soon enough, being handed 2 big thumbs ups by Nintendo, with the impression that it'll be a fun party game made for the casual audience. But while Dragon King was met with high praise from other developers at Nintendo, if the average fighting game players saw this back then, they would probably burn it to the ground and quarter circle back crack shoot that motherfucker. Official images and gameplay footage of Dragon King shows us that this prototype pretty much follows the same exact rules as the Smash Bros. We know today. You attack your enemies to a higher number until they're more sensitive to getting knocked out of frame. Much of what we can obtain from this footage shows us the many features that were in this prototype, and the many more that were not. While it had things like shielding, dashing, smash attacks, aerials, and an early battlefield with different variations of platforms, there were still a lot of puzzles missing from it becoming a fully fleshed out game. For one, because this prototype was supposed to become its own IP with OCs, no Nintendo characters were designed yet, and are instead textureless characters resembling Captain Falcon. Side note, so technically, in reference to their model design, attributes, and moveset, Captain Falcon is technically the first fighter in Smash. And I know the idea of Captain Falcon wasn't relevant at this stage of development since they're only considering OCs, but come on, who else would have fit this criteria? Sorry, editor's side note. So as I'm looking through this gameplay more, I'm realizing that the movesets for this guy doesn't entirely resemble Captain Falcon's. In fact, he has attacks that would later be used for different characters, such as Fox's up smash and Mario and Luigi's down smash. But he does use Falcon's jab. I rest my case. There were no special moves, dodges, taunts, or items. The damage meters were on the top, with different colors representing each player. In the background, a simple JPEG from one of the branches outside at HAL Laboratory. Now, obviously, this is just a prototype. It's nowhere near becoming the final product, and if it was released like this...
Hey, come on!
But despite all these missing features, why did Nintendo approve of this prototype and give Sakurai the green light for further development? Well, in Sakurai's eyes, the execution of Dragon King was merely a demonstration of his concept. Around this time, 2D fighters were the thing to play. Every arcade store you stopped by, there would always be a machine for some fighting game. It didn't matter which franchise it was, as long as 2 characters were fighting each other on a flat stage, people were drawn in. I mean, why fight someone in real life when you can do it virtually? With a caveat. Because of the growing competitive nature 2D fighters were starting to establish, Sakurai noticed that combos were getting complicated. With directional tilts and precise command inputs, relying on fixed strings of controls to determine the outcome of your battle made it unfair for the casual player to keep up with. The more combos you knew, the less room there was for creative strategy. And as the genre's popularity grew, so did its skill cap, leaving new players overwhelmed for all the mechanics you had to inject into your system to even get a glimpse of what it's like to be in the advantage state.
No, you're cheating.
You're gonna learn!
This is the real world. You learned it early, son.
That's all you ever do in your house?
In response to this, Sakurai envisioned a more universal concept in Dragon King with the goal of bringing in players of all skill levels through creative impulses and simple controls. Unlike a traditional fighter, Dragon King uses percentages as its damage system. With accumulated damage, each attack outputs different levels of knockback and hit stun. Rather than being stuck in the same position after the first attack, performing strings in Dragon King started to be more strategic as your enemy reacts differently with every hit. And this became the reason why Smash uses percentages instead of health bars. The goal isn't to deplete your enemy's health with predetermined knowledge, but get them out of bounds through improvised strings. An antithesis to fighting games, but not a rejection. In addition to the absence of a health meter, your objective has now become to just knock your enemies off screen. Whether how high or low your skills had to be. The philosophy of playing what you want and how you want to was the focal point of Sakurai's concept, in which Dragon King became the initial execution for what would eventually be a genre-defining, or rather, genre-creating game. Also, tired of having to tilt the analog stick in a specific order every time you want to get the move you want? Well, how about just... You know, for a concept that seemed so simple, yet so distinct from the norm at the time, felt super risky for any game studio, let alone Nintendo, to put out as an original series. And it's not even like this was the first case where this idea was demonstrated in a video game. In fact, games like Savage Rain, the Outfoxies, and Joust, if you really want to get specific, can technically be considered as the DNA for the yet unspecified platform fighter. Yet the only reason why Dragon King made its way out to be a massive success than others was because of Nintendo. Once Dragon King convinced Nintendo enough to give Sakurai that green light, a problem arose. Sakurai didn't have anyone to help him. The rest of HAL Laboratory were busy working on other games for the release of the N64. So Sakurai waited and waited until Nintendo was like, alright, y'all gotta release something or we're So HAL Laboratory jumped into his car and went full gears into expanding this prototype. As further developments would slowly advance this game to become fully polished, Sakurai witnessed another obstacle that reflected with the issues of these 2D fighters. Not so much of how the characters played, but the characters themselves. The original proposal for Dragon King was to create a complete roster of new characters, but this idea soon became short-lived. A common feature these fighting games struggled with was creating a roster of too many characters that had potential as the franchise's representative. When making a game through a designer's perspective, you ideally want to introduce just 1 to 2 main characters and then expand that onto multiple side characters as you further progress into the game. This makes character development much easier for not only the player to digest, but also for the developer to maintain that consistency with how much a protagonist should be presented. But when you make a fighting game, that entire ideology gets quarter-circled back the way with multiple main characters just showing up out of nowhere. It's hard enough for a game to intrigue new players into caring about unfamiliar movesets and archetypes, but when you play as a certain character and you match against your older brother, or a character that resembles your younger sister who was kidnapped and had her physical traits be used to create other characters, or even yourself, but not really because this one is actually a future past incarnation of yourself from 100 years in an alternate universe, the whole thing just ends up becoming a blur. Now, this franchise, along with other games like Tekken and Street Fighter, can be contemporary exceptions of this common issue, since they've spent decades in evolving the same cast of characters through multiple installments for players to grow a stronger affection with them and eventually recognize them as flagships for the franchise. And while this might have not been the case in their first installments, when you considered fighting games in the arcade setting, character development was more secondary since players were satisfied enough with the fighting itself. Just sitting down and playing or watching someone play kinda solved its own problem, where at the very least, if you're rooting for a person to win with a character, you'd eventually start favoring that character yourself, which by nature creates the beginning of the character's affection and for years to come. So what does all of this have to do with Sakurai's issue in developing Dragon King? Well, essentially, none of this aligns with what he wanted. Creating a fighting game for a home console made character development more of a priority, as unlike an arcade, establishing a general atmosphere for a world was crucial for a home console game that players can sit down with longer and truly take in much more. Sakurai felt that a game for a console, let alone the Nintendo 64, needed better depth to intrigue audiences into playing, but the OCs he had initially planned for Dragon King looked and played too similar with each other. Would have been fine in a 2D fighter arcade, but Sakurai was already visualizing his game as a 4-player fighter. Yeah, just imagine this for 5 more installments. With these limitations, Sakurai kept working on his prototype while brainstorming ideas until he realized, this is for the Nintendo 64. Why don't I just ask to use Nintendo characters? And this would probably be the best decision he's made for this game's existence. Other than, L canceling, but that's like a whole nother 2 years ahead. Instead of designing an entirely new roster of characters that you don't even know will do well, using main characters from a catalog of popular franchises became a genius idea of inviting familiar audiences into unfamiliar territory. Utilizing the recognition of these characters put less weight on the developers and marketers, where whatever concept you introduce to these audiences now will feel more comfortable in trying it out. I mean, these characters were at their peak of fame, with classic after classic after... well, most characters. Having this new concept in mind, with thumbs up of approval by Nintendo yet again, Sakurai and his team re-envisioned the design for Dragon King and eventually reshaped this prototype into a fun party game made for the casual audience. After developments for this game were finished, it was finally time to showcase this outside the development team. And surprisingly enough, first impressions for this game were pretty mixed within Nintendo. Developers for other games at the company were having a blast. People are gonna love this. It's gonna be a massive success and will lay the foundation for many other studios to make their own versions of this type of game. The business people, however, were a bit more constructive. No, this is never gonna work. Nintendo characters beating each other up? What, we're trying to make a Mortal Kombat and have our game banned? Do you want our company to fail? But that was before they started playing the game. Perhaps the hardest demographic Sakurai and his team had to convince this game to were the players. The core gameplay in Smash Bros. Was nearly a 180 to traditional fighting games, so it was hard to get this game across to both a general audience that had preconceptions of how a fighting game works, and a more hardcore fanbase where they've embedded pretzel motion as muscle memory. In response to this, Sakurai created the Smash Bros. Dojo, a website dedicated to showing specific techniques and features the game had in order to ease in that accessibility for players to pick up the game and understand how it works. Soon enough, word started to spread around the Smash Bros. Game, it finally releases on the N64, and the rest is history. But if it wasn't for Nintendo to allow their own characters to beat each other up, Smash Bros. Wouldn't be as influential in character representation for other studios to add culturally impactful crossovers into their roster. If it wasn't for Dragon King, the concept of a platform fighter would have been forgotten, and none of these games would ever help showcase more opportunities for one to reach higher technical skills. And if it wasn't for Sakurai to take a huge risk into a well-established genre in order to cater for future generations of players to experience the enjoyment of playing a game, we wouldn't have a community of both casualness and competition in a game for it to last decades and forevermore. And if it wasn't for this guy, we wouldn't have this.
Oh man.
Oh, this could be it.
Oh wow.
Oh my. Oh my god!
Oh my god!
I will swear on my life that this is Captain Falcon. I mean, who else could it have been? Like, why would Sakurai even scrap a character like this? Like, it just...